March 14th, 1941. The night sky over London was not black, it was alive. Flames from burning warehouses painted the clouds orange and red. The smell of cordite and burning wood filled the air so thick you could taste it. And above it all, hidden somewhere in that poisoned darkness, a German Heinkel He 111 droned steadily onward, invisible, untouchable, dropping its payload with methodical precision. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So, if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Flight Lieutenant John Cunningham sat strapped into the cramped cockpit of his Bristol Beaufighter, his gloved hands gripping the control stick with white-knuckled intensity, his eyes strained against the darkness, scanning the void ahead. Nothing. Just blackness. Beside him, his radar operator, Sergeant Jimmy Rawnsley, hunched over a glowing green screen no bigger than a dinner plate, watching ghostly blips flicker and fade. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. John had been hunting for 23 minutes. 23 minutes of circling, climbing, diving through invisible air, chasing coordinates radioed from the ground. 23 minutes of nothing. The enemy was out there. He could hear the distant throb of German engines, but he couldn't see them, not with his eyes, not with his instincts. He was flying blind in every sense of the word. This was the nightmare that haunted every night fighter pilot in 1941. You were sent up into total darkness, told there was an enemy bomber somewhere within miles of your position, and expected to find it, close with it, and destroy it all without ever seeing it until the last possible second. If you were lucky, you might catch a silhouette against the flames below. If you weren't, you'd burn through your fuel, land back at base, and try again the next night. Most nights, you failed. The numbers told the story. In the first 6 months of the Blitz, from September 1940 to February 1941, British night fighters managed to shoot down fewer than 20 German bombers. 20, out of thousands of sorties. That meant British pilots were succeeding less than 1% of the time. For every 100 interception attempts, 99 ended with the bomber escaping unscathed into the night. The Luftwaffe knew it. German bomber crews flew with a kind of grim confidence during those early months. They understood that once they crossed the English coast after dark, they were almost invulnerable. British anti-aircraft fire was crude, shooting blind into the sky, more likely to hit its own civilians than an enemy aircraft. Searchlights swept back and forth like the fingers of a blind man, occasionally catching a glint of metal, but never long enough for fighters to close in. And so the bombers came, night after night. London, Coventry, Birmingham, Liverpool, each city burned in turn. Factories were destroyed. Thousands of civilians died in their homes. And the Royal Air Force, for all its bravery during the daylight Battle of Britain, seemed powerless to stop the slaughter after dark. John Cunningham knew this better than most. He'd flown more than 40 night sorties by March of 1941 and had exactly 2 kills to his name. 2. Both had been sheer luck, catching enemy bombers silhouetted against fires, closing to point-blank range before they even knew he was there. Every other mission had been a lesson in futility. He would chase radar contacts that disappeared. He would spot exhaust flames only to lose them seconds later when the bomber changed course. He would return to base with a full ammunition load, the weight of failure pressing down harder than any physical burden. Jimmy Rawnsley, his radar operator, was the real hero in these hunts. The AI airborne interception radar was new, experimental, and maddeningly unreliable. It could detect an aircraft at ranges up to 4 miles under perfect conditions, but perfect conditions were rare. The radar screen showed a fuzzy green blob that might be a bomber, or might be a flock of birds, or might be interference from ground clutter. Jimmy had to interpret these phantoms, calling out ranges and bearings, while John flew the aircraft entirely on instruments, trusting coordinates he couldn't verify with his own eyes. It was a partnership built on blind faith. John couldn't see the enemy. Jimmy couldn't fly the plane. Together, they had to become a single weapon, one mind split between 2 bodies, each trusting the other completely in a situation where doubt meant death. Tonight, Jimmy's voice crackled over the intercom. Contact. 2 miles, 12 o'clock, slightly above. John pulled back on the stick, climbing into the freezing blackness. His altimeter read 8,000 feet. The air was thin and cold. Ice formed on the windscreen, further reducing what little visibility he had. He flew by feel, by sound, by the faint glow of his instruments. The engines roared, the airframe shuddered, and somewhere ahead, invisible, was the enemy. 1.5 miles, still 12 o'clock. Closing. John eased the throttle forward. The Beaufighter surged, his heart hammered. This was the moment, the gap between hope and reality, between training and chaos. In daylight, you could see your target from miles away. You could judge its speed, its altitude, its intentions. At night, with only radar to guide you, you were hunting a ghost. 1 mile. Drifting left. Turn 5 degrees port. John banked gently, trusting Jimmy's voice more than his own senses. Outside the cockpit, there was nothing. No moon. No stars. Just an oppressive, suffocating darkness that seemed to press against the glass. He blinked hard, trying to force his eyes to adapt, but there was nothing to adapt to. The sky was a void. 1/2 mile. Dead ahead. You should have visual any second now. John leaned forward, squinting into the blackness. His eyes ached from the strain. He scanned left, right, up, down, and then… there it was. A faint shape, darker than the surrounding night, a subtle disruption in the texture of the sky. The Heinkel. It hung there, suspended in nothingness, its engines a low, steady rumble. For a moment, John felt a surge of primal fear. He was closing on an enemy he could barely see, in a sky where any mistake, a stall, a spin, a collision, meant death. There were no landmarks, no ground, no sense of up or down, just the target and the void. He lined up the gun sight. The Beaufighter carried 4 20mm cannons in its nose and 6 machine guns in the wings, enough firepower to shred the bomber in seconds. But only if he could get close enough, only if he could hold the aim, only if the enemy didn't see him first and take evasive action. At 300 yards, John opened fire. The cannons roared, spitting flame into the night. Tracers arced forward, brilliant red lines cutting through the darkness. For a split second, the Heinkel was illuminated in the muzzle flash, a pale grey ghost caught in a moment of violence. Then it exploded. A flash of orange, a rolling ball of fire, and the bomber disintegrated. Burning fragments tumbled through the sky, trailing smoke and sparks. John pulled hard on the stick, banking away to avoid the debris. His heart pounded, his hands trembled. He'd done it. He'd found the enemy in total darkness and destroyed it. But as the adrenaline faded, a deeper realization set in. He hadn't really seen the bomber, not with his eyes, not in any natural sense. He'd seen it on a radar screen, as a coordinate, as an abstraction. The kill hadn't been about skill or instinct. It had been about technology, about trusting something inhuman to guide him through an environment where human senses failed. This was the new reality of night fighting. You didn't hunt with your eyes. You hunted with electronics, with invisible beams bouncing off invisible targets, with green blips on a glowing screen. And if you couldn't accept that, if you couldn't surrender your instincts to the cold logic of physics, you would never survive. Back at RAF Middle Wallop, John and Jimmy climbed out of the Beaufighter in silence. The ground crew swarmed the aircraft, checking for damage, refueling, rearming. Other pilots gathered around, asking about the mission, slapping John on the back, congratulating him. But he felt no triumph, only exhaustion, and a quiet, gnawing question. How many more bombers were out there, still invisible, still untouchable? The answer was thousands. The Luftwaffe's night bombing campaign was relentless, and while John Cunningham was becoming one of Britain's most successful night fighter pilots, he would eventually earn the nickname Cat's Eyes. Cunningham, the larger truth remained. Most British pilots still couldn't find their targets. The technology existed, but the skill to use it, the psychology to trust it, had not yet spread. Across the country, Night fighter squadrons struggled with the same problem. Pilots trained in daylight combat, where visual contact was everything, found themselves disoriented and helpless in the dark. Radar operators, many of them hastily trained radio mechanics, struggled to interpret the fuzzy, unreliable signals. Coordination between pilot and operator was clumsy, tentative, and all the while, German bombers continued to strike with near impunity. The RAF's leadership knew something had to change. Night fighting couldn't rely on luck or individual brilliance. It needed to become a system, a repeatable, teachable method that could turn ordinary pilots into effective hunters. But how do you teach someone to trust what they can't see? How do you train instinct out of a man and replace it with cold, electronic precision? The answer would come from an unlikely place, not from the skies over Britain, but from the laboratories and training fields where a handful of scientists and instructors began to realize that the real enemy wasn't the German bombers. It was human nature itself. In the early months of 1941, the RAF established specialized night fighter training units. These weren't the glamorous fighter schools where young men learned aerobatics and dogfighting. These were grimmer, more methodical places where the lessons were taught in darkness and failure. The instructors faced a brutal truth. Most pilots couldn't unlearn their instincts fast enough to survive. When you've spent your entire flying career relying on your eyes, on visual cues, on the horizon and the ground and the position of the sun asking you to fly blind, to trust a radar operator's voice and a glowing screen was like asking you to forget how to breathe. One instructor at RAF Cranage described the problem bluntly. We'd send a pilot up at night with a radar operator, give them a practice target, and watch them fail again and again. The pilot would chase the contact, get within range, and then freeze. He'd be staring out the windscreen, looking for something his eyes couldn't see, while the bomber slipped away. We had to break them of that habit. We had to teach them to fly with their ears, not their eyes. Pilots flew mock interceptions night after night, guided only by their radar operators, learning to trust coordinates and ranges without visual confirmation. They practiced in pitch darkness, with no ground lights, no reference points, nothing but the instruments and the voice in their headset. Some pilots adapted quickly, others never did. And then there were the technical limitations. The AI radar of 1941 was crude by later standards. Its effective range was short, usually 3 to 4 miles under ideal conditions. Ground clutter from cities and hills created false returns. Rain and clouds degraded the signal, and the radar couldn't tell you the target's altitude with precision, so pilots often found themselves chasing contacts that were thousands of feet above or below them. Jimmy Rawnsley once described a mission where he tracked a contact for 10 minutes, guiding John Cunningham through a series of turns and climbs, only to realize at the last second that the target was actually a British bomber returning from a raid over Germany. They'd nearly shot down one of their own. After that, identification became even more critical and even more difficult. In total darkness, friend and foe looked identical on a radar screen, but slowly, painfully, a new generation of night fighter crews began to emerge. Men like Cunningham and Rawnsley, who had mastered the art of blind interception. They learned to read the rhythms of radar, to anticipate where a bomber would turn, to close the distance without overshooting. They learned to operate in a sensory void, where everything depended on coordination, communication, and an almost telepathic understanding between pilot and operator. And as their skills improved, the kill rates began to climb. By the summer of 1941, British night fighters were destroying German bombers at 5 times the rate they had 6 months earlier. It still wasn't enough to stop the raids entirely, but it was progress. More importantly, it was proof that human beings could adapt, that with the right training and the right tools, they could fight effectively in conditions that seemed impossible. But for every success, there were reminders of the cost: empty beds in the squadron barracks, aircraft that didn't return, pilots who got disoriented in the darkness and flew into the ground, radar operators who misjudged a range and sent their pilot into a collision. Night fighting was unforgiving. One mistake, one moment of doubt, and you were gone. John Cunningham flew his 100th night mission in July of 1941. By then, He had 20 kills, more than any other British night fighter pilot, but he never celebrated. He knew that his success wasn't about being a better pilot or having sharper eyes. It was about surrendering to the technology, about trusting something inhuman to guide him through the dark. And that surrender came with a psychological cost. In interviews after the war, Cunningham rarely spoke about the fear, but those who flew with him saw it, the tension before each mission, the silence afterward. The way he would sit in the cockpit after landing, staring at nothing, as if trying to reconcile what he'd done with what he believed he should have been able to do. The truth was, night fighting violated every instinct a pilot had. You were trained to trust your senses, to see the enemy, to react based on what you observed. But at night, your senses lied to you. The darkness played tricks. Your eyes saw shapes that weren't there. Your ears heard engines that were miles away. The only thing you could trust was the voice of your radar operator and the flickering green light on the screen. And so the question remained, how do you fight an enemy you can't see? How do you kill something invisible? The answer was as cold and mechanical as the radar itself. You stopped trying to see. You stopped relying on instinct. You became a machine, guided by electronics, executing a programmed sequence of maneuvers that felt wrong every step of the way. But it worked. And that was the horrible, beautiful truth. It worked. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work. So if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. The German Luftwaffe was watching. They'd seen the British night fighter successes beginning to mount, and they knew exactly what it meant. The hunters were becoming the hunted. By late 1941, as the Blitz began to wind down, the strategic calculus of the TARC air war was shifting. Britain's bombers, the Wellingtons, Hamptons, and Stirlings, were now flying deeper into German territory each night, striking industrial targets, rail yards, and cities. And just like the British had struggled to stop German bombers over London, the Germans now faced the same impossible problem. How do you find and destroy an enemy flying through total darkness? The answer, predictably, was the same: radar. But the Germans approached the problem differently. While the British had focused on developing airborne radar for their fighters, the Germans initially relied on ground-based radar stations that would guide fighters toward incoming bomber streams using radio directions. This system, called Himmelbett, four-poster bed, divided the night sky into sectors, each monitored by a ground controller who would vector a single night fighter toward a single target. It was methodical, efficient, and deeply flawed. Each Himmelbett zone could only handle one interception at a time. If the British sent over 50 bombers, 49 would pass through unmolested while a single fighter chased a single target. The system was overwhelmed almost from the start. German night fighter pilots, men like Helmut Lent and Werner Streib, racked up impressive kill counts, but the larger bomber streams kept growing. The mathematics were brutal. The Germans simply didn't have enough fighters or enough radar coverage to stop the raids. And so, just as the British had done, the Germans turned to onboard radar. By 1942, German night fighters like the Messerschmitt Bf 110 and the Junkers Ju 88 were being fitted with Liechtenstein radar, a system with distinctive antler-like antennas sprouting from the nose. The radar had a range of about 2 miles, enough to guide a pilot to within visual distance of a bomber. But like the British AI radar, it was crude, unreliable, and demanded a level of trust that many pilots found psychologically unbearable. Major Werner Streib, one of Germany's top night fighter aces, described his first radar-guided kill in his post-war memoir. He wrote that he felt like a blind man being led by a stranger. His radar operator, sitting behind him in the cramped fuselage of the Bf 110, would call out ranges and bearings, and Streib would adjust his heading, climbing or diving based purely on numbers. He couldn't see the target. He couldn't verify the information. He simply had to trust that the invisible electronic pulse was real, that the blip on the screen corresponded to an actual bomber made of metal and men. When he finally spotted the target, a British Wellington Streib felt a rush of relief so intense it almost overwhelmed him. The bomber was real. The radar hadn't lied. He closed to 200 yards, lined up his sights, and opened fire. The Wellington broke apart in a shower of flame and debris. Strybe banked away, his hands shaking, and realized that he'd just experienced something profoundly unnatural. He'd killed an enemy he'd never truly seen, guided by a machine that saw things human eyes could not. This was the psychological shift that defined night fighting for both sides. Pilots were no longer warriors in the traditional sense. They were operators of weapon systems. The romance of aerial combat, the dogfights, the duels, the individual skill was being replaced by something colder and more terrifying. You didn't outfight your opponent. You simply executed a technical procedure, following instructions from a radar screen until the target was in range and you pressed the trigger. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The British, meanwhile, were evolving their tactics in response to German defences. By 1943, RAF Bomber Command was sending out massive formations, hundreds of bombers in a single night, overwhelming the German Himmelbett system through sheer numbers. But the losses were still catastrophic. On a typical raid over the Ruhr or Berlin, the RAF could expect to lose 5 to 7% of its force. That meant on a mission with 300 bombers, 15 to 20 aircraft wouldn't return. Each bomber carried 7 crew members. Do the math. Every major raid cost more than 100 lives. The bomber crews knew the odds. They could calculate their chances of survival over a 30-mission tour. The numbers were grim. Less than half would make it through. Some crews lasted 1 mission. Others lasted 5 or 10. The ones who survived to 30 were either extraordinarily lucky or extraordinarily skilled, and even they would tell you it was mostly luck. And in the darkness above Germany, the night fighters prowled. German pilots developed tactics specifically designed to exploit the bombers' vulnerabilities. The most effective was called schräge Musik, slanted music, a pair of upward-firing cannons mounted in the fuselage of the night fighter. The tactic was devastatingly simple. A German pilot would position his aircraft directly beneath a British bomber, invisible in the blind spot below, and fire upward into the fuel tanks and bomb bay. The bomber would explode before the crew even knew they were under attack. British bomber crews began reporting strange losses. Aircraft would suddenly erupt in flames for no apparent reason, no flak, no visible fighter, just instant death. The losses mounted through 1943 and into 1944. Entire squadrons were decimated. The crews that survived spoke in hushed tones about the unseen enemy, the ghost fighters that killed without warning. It wasn't until a German night fighter equipped with schräge Musik was forced to land in Switzerland and was examined by Allied intelligence that the British finally understood what was happening. The revelation was chilling. The bombers had been flying for months with a critical blind spot, and the Germans had been exploiting it ruthlessly. Countermeasures were developed, warning systems, repositioned gunners, new formations, but the damage had been done. Thousands of airmen had died fighting an enemy they never saw. The psychological toll on both sides was immense. British bomber crews flew, knowing that death could come at any second, from any direction, without warning. German night fighter pilots flew, knowing that each kill was a statistical inevitability, not a test of skill. The personal element of combat, the sense of facing another human being in a fair fight, had been stripped away. You were either a target or a hunter, and the only thing that separated the two was technology. John Cunningham, still flying missions in 1943, now had more than 20 confirmed kills. The British press had dubbed him Cat's Eyes Cunningham, perpetuating the myth that his success came from exceptional night vision enhanced by eating carrots. It was propaganda, of course, a cover story to hide the existence of British airborne radar from the Germans. But Cunningham played along, understanding that the truth was less romantic and more uncomfortable. In reality, Cunningham had simply become very good at trusting his radar operator. He'd learned to fly entirely on instruments, to ignore his senses, to suppress the instinct to look for the enemy with his own eyes. He'd become, in essence, a component of a larger machine, a human element in an electronic system designed to kill at a distance. The cost of that transformation was visible in the way he flew. Other pilots who flew with Cunningham described him as eerily calm, almost detached. He didn't react emotionally when he made a kill. He didn't celebrate or mourn. He would simply execute the intercept, destroy the target, and return to base, as if he'd completed a routine training exercise. Some admired his professionalism. Others found it disturbing. By mid-1944, both the British and German night fighter forces had evolved into highly efficient killing machines. The British had introduced the de Havilland Mosquito, a fast, twin-engine fighter bomber equipped with improved AI radar, which became the RAF's premier night fighter. The Germans countered with improved versions of the Bf 110 and Ju 88, along with new tactics and better radar. The night sky over Europe had become a technological battleground, where survival depended entirely on electronics, coordination, and the ability to fight blind. But the strategic picture was shifting. The Allied invasion of Normandy in June 1944, followed by the grinding advance across France and into Germany, meant that the Luftwaffe was being stretched to the breaking point. Fuel shortages crippled training. Experienced pilots were killed faster than they could be replaced. And as the front lines moved closer to Germany, the night fighter units found themselves defending an ever-shrinking territory. Werner Streib flew his last combat mission in October 1944. By then, he had 66 confirmed kills, making him one of Germany's top night fighter aces. But he later admitted that by the end, the missions had become mechanical, almost meaningless. There were so many Allied bombers that shooting one down made no difference to the outcome. The war was already lost. He was simply going through the motions, executing a technical procedure night after night, until the fuel ran out or the orders stopped coming. For the British bomber crews, the final months of the war brought a grim kind of relief. German night fighter resistance was collapsing. Raids that once cost dozens of aircraft now returned with minimal losses, but the relief was tempered by the knowledge of what had been sacrificed to reach that point. More than 55,000 British and Commonwealth airmen had died in bomber command over the course of the war. Many of those deaths had come, at night, at the hands of an enemy they never saw. John Cunningham survived the war. He flew his final combat mission in April 1945 as Germany collapsed. In total, he was credited with 20 kills, a modest number compared to the great daylight aces, but exceptional for night fighting, where opportunities were rare and conditions brutally unforgiving. After the war, he became a test pilot, eventually flying early jet aircraft. But he never spoke publicly about the psychological cost of night fighting, about what it meant to kill in darkness, guided by machines, without ever truly seeing the men he was destroying. The legacy of the night fighters is complicated. On one hand, they represented an extraordinary technological and tactical achievement. The ability to intercept and destroy enemy aircraft in total darkness, using primitive radar and rudimentary coordination, was a testament to human ingenuity and adaptability. Both the British and the Germans developed systems that worked, that saved lives, that turned an impossible problem into a manageable one. But on the other hand, night fighting marked a fundamental shift in the nature of warfare. It stripped combat of its personal dimension, turning pilots into operators and kills into statistics. The night fighter aces weren't celebrated like their daylight counterparts. There were no dramatic dogfights to describe, no moments of individual heroism that captured the public imagination. Just cold, mechanical efficiency. You followed the radar, closed the distance, and fired. The target exploded, or it didn't. Then you went home and did it again the next night. The men who flew these missions carried the weight of that reality for the rest of their lives. Some adapted, compartmentalizing the experience, treating it as a job that needed to be done. Others struggled with the memory of killing invisibly, of never seeing the faces of the men they'd destroyed, of reducing human beings to green blips on a radar screen. In 1971, John Cunningham attended a reunion of RAF night fighter veterans. He was in his 50s by then, grey-haired and retired. Someone asked him what it had been like, flying those missions, hunting in the dark. He was quiet for a long time before he answered. "It was like being blind," he said finally. "You couldn't trust your eyes. You couldn't trust your instincts. You had to trust the machine. And the machine didn't care whether you lived or died. It just showed you where the enemy was. The rest was up to you. Someone else asked if he ever thought about the German bomber crews he'd shot down, the men who'd died in those explosions, who'd never seen him coming. Cunningham looked away. All the time, he said. But I try not to. Because if I think about it too much, I remember that they never had a chance. We hunted them in the dark, and they never even knew we were there. That's not combat. That's something else. I don't have a word for it. The room went silent. No one had a word for it either. Because what the night fighters had done, what both sides had learned to do, was to remove the human element from killing. They'd turned aerial combat into a technical exercise, a problem of physics and electronics. And while that made them more effective, it also made the experience more haunting. There was no honor in shooting down an enemy who never saw you. There was no relief in survival when you knew that your success came from exploiting an opponent's blindness. The post-war years brought technological advancements that made night fighting even more efficient. Jet engines, improved radar, guided missiles, all of these made it easier to find and destroy targets in darkness. But the psychological cost remained. The pilots who flew these missions, from Korea to Vietnam to the Gulf Wars, all described the same unsettling feeling, that they were fighting ghosts, killing at a distance, never confronting the reality of what they were doing until it was already done. Werner Streib, the German ace, wrote in his memoir that he never felt like a hero. I felt like an executioner, he wrote. I would position my aircraft beneath the bomber, fire the Schräge Musik, and watch it explode. The crew never knew I was there. They died without ever understanding what had killed them. I was efficient. I was effective. But I was not a warrior. I was something else, something that belonged to the machines, not to the men. That sentiment echoed across the testimonies of night fighter pilots from both sides. They'd been asked to do something fundamentally unnatural, to kill without seeing, to trust technology over instinct, to suppress their humanity in service of military efficiency, and they'd done it because the war demanded it, because there was no alternative. But the cost lingered long after the guns fell silent. The story of the night fighters is ultimately about adaptation, about human beings learning to operate in conditions that seemed impossible, using tools that violated their deepest instincts. It's about the moment when warfare stopped being a contest between individuals and became a contest between systems. And it's about the quiet, unspoken burden carried by the men who lived through that transition, the knowledge that they'd crossed a threshold that couldn't be uncrossed. Today, air combat is almost entirely beyond visual range. Modern fighters engage targets they never see, guided by radar and computers, firing missiles from dozens of miles away. The pilot's role has become even more abstract, even more detached from the physical reality of killing. But the psychological challenge remains the same. How do you reconcile the act of taking a life with the absence of any direct human connection to that life? The night fighter pilots of World War II were the first generation to confront that question. They didn't have good answers. Most of them just tried to forget, to move on, to bury the memories of those dark skies and invisible enemies. But their experience remains relevant, a reminder that technology can make us more effective without making us more comfortable with what we're doing. John Cunningham died in 2002 at the age of 84. His obituaries praised his skill, his bravery, his contributions to aviation. But the inner experience, the psychological cost of hunting blindly, of trusting machines over instinct, of killing without seeing, that remained largely untold. Because some experiences resist easy explanation. Some truths are too complicated, too uncomfortable, to fit into a simple narrative of heroism or sacrifice. The night fighters learned to see in the dark, but what they saw was something that haunted them for the rest of their lives. They learned that the most efficient way to kill is to remove the human element entirely, to let the machines guide you, to trust the radar, to execute the procedure without thought or hesitation. They learned that survival sometimes means surrendering your instincts, your senses, your humanity, and becoming part of the system. And they learned that victory, when it comes in darkness, when it's measured in invisible kills and statistical probabilities, doesn't feel like victory at all. It feels like something else, something colder, something that lingers in the quiet moments, in the memories of green radar screens and distant explosions, in the knowledge that you fought an enemy you never truly saw, and that maybe, in the end, that was the most terrifying thing of all. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.